It's a frustrating dilemma when the state abandons one of the few legitimate duties it actually has, bringing criminals to justice and keeping them within just confines. And frustrating is a drastic understatement, actually. It's a lethal dilemma. One that demands you sacrifice your life in one way or the other. Either you submit to the unpredictable violence of a criminal who could kill you in an instant, or you stop the threat and the state comes for your life instead. Of course, there is a third option, just abstain from society entirely. That's the option that gets more attractive by the day. But assuming you would like to participate in society in basic ways like going to the mall or going to the grocery store, or in this case, like going to a restaurant, a lethal criminal threat to you and others arising in an instant is always a possibility. When the state abandons its responsibility to remove the people who create these threats from society, the responsibility is left to us to deal with the threat. And if we do deal with it because the state refused to, and there's an ideologically driven prosecutor who believes in punishing vigilante citizens more harshly than the instigating criminals, well, then you end up with the worst form of this dilemma, being at the mercy of both the criminal and the state teaming up against you. We may have some form of that situation developing in Houston. It's not totally clear yet, but it would appear that all the ingredients are there. A career criminal who shouldn't even be free, threatening people in public, an armed citizen taking care of that threat himself, and now, thanks to perhaps imperfect protocol in that impromptu garbage removal, the prospect of the state bringing supposed justice to the armed citizen to make up for the justice they failed to bring the first time. The incident happened late at night on Thursday the 5th at El Ranchito Taqueria in southwest Houston. The entire incident was captured on surveillance video inside the restaurant. It's obviously very graphic, and so I can only show you still frames of key moments, but the footage is linked in the description if you'd like to see it unedited. Just before 11:30 p.m., an armed masked man barges into the restaurant, pointing what appears to be a gun at customers and demanding wallets and purses and other valuables. After he patrols around the store collecting what he can, he turns toward the door. One of the dining men draws a gun of his own and within about 7 seconds fires 9 rounds into the criminal, who died at the scene. I think he died about 5 separate times, actually. If you watch the footage, there is no doubt that the threat was eliminated, causing some to say that elimination was overdone, which we'll get to in a minute. But the intervening armed citizen grabbed the criminal's apparent gun from the ground, realized it was actually a fake plastic one, and in frustration, threw it across the room, breaking it against the wall. Now, the fact that the gun was fake is, of course, irrelevant to the case, either legally or morally. It's not on the victims to evaluate if the barrel pointed at their faces is in fact real and loaded. It's on the guy pointing it not to make that threat in the first place. All that matters is it's reasonably perceived as a lethal threat, and of course, this was. The guy who stopped the threat, along with many others in the restaurant, decided that's enough tacos for tonight, and he went home. Police put out a statement looking for the man the next day on Friday. By Monday, they had identified him and spoken with him. Since at this point he has not been charged with a crime, he has remained anonymous, but he's given a statement through his lawyer saying the event was very traumatic, that taking a human life is not something he takes lightly, and it will burden him for the rest of his life. Undoubtedly, but better to be burdened by the stress of the incident than to be burdened by your death. That is the choice that the man faced. That's the choice that the criminal brought to him. Who's responsible for the origin of that burden is very clear. And the fact that it happened at all isn't all that's regrettable either. Its predictability is too. For as poorly as it ended for him, this criminal was practiced in the habit. It's not his first time doing this. It's not his first time threatening lives or even taking one, at least indirectly. As mentioned, this is a guy who shouldn't have even been free for tacos and a gunfight night in the first place. His name was Eric Eugene Washington. He was 30 years old. Speaking with local media, his family emphasizes that he was a father to a newborn and had just got a new job. But those are bullet points on a resume that otherwise features, well, bullets and a career of threats made with them. Washington was just released from prison at some point in 2022, out on parole from a 2015 prison sentence on conviction of, yes, aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon, as in pointing guns at people to take their stuff before. He was part of a group that robbed a business owner and, yes, shot him to death, though it doesn't sound like Washington himself was the shooter in that case. Washington's mom says he was just there, wrong place, wrong time. I always hate it when I'm just hanging out with my friends and then one of them buzz kills the party by accidentally shooting an elderly business owner and then accidentally taking all his cash. And notably, this time, Washington didn't even have any friends with him. It was just him. So I'm going to infer that his problem with violence was a little deeper than just bad influences, also because that's not even the full extent of his prior violence. Just last month in December, presumably while still on parole, he was charged with assaulting his girlfriend, and he bonded out. Now, how that's not a parole violation, I am entirely unclear, but whatever the case, you have a guy who just can't quit the violence and a justice system that just can't quit letting him go. Which brings us to the final piece of this dilemma, punishing the guy who was forced to clean up that mess. He gets a gun pointed in his face, or at least what he believes to be and is designed to convince him is a gun. And if he doesn't behave exactly perfectly in response to that execution threat, we're going to call him some sort of criminal. To be fair, there are a lot of steps yet to happen before that worst case scenario is a reality, but the steps are underway. On Monday, Houston police announced after consultation with the Harris County District Attorney, the case will be referred to a grand jury to determine if charges are justified. To bring a felony charge in Texas, the case has to go to a grand jury, but of course, the decision to pursue charges by bringing the case to a grand jury at all is entirely at the discretion of the prosecutor. So what explains that move? Well, some say it's a corrupt prosecutor. Some say it's the technicals of this particular shoot, or it could be both. It sounds like a stale meme to shake your fist and scream Soros at the sky, but that is at least part of the story. Kim Ogg is the Harris County District Attorney. She was first elected in 2016, assisted by at least $500,000 in advertising spending from, yes, George Soros. And her prosecutorial career has followed the pattern we've seen elsewhere, a campaign on criminal justice reform that is translated into a career of just less criminal justice. Case dismissal rates have greatly increased in the years since, and it's not just low-level charges getting dropped either. According to a Houston Chronicle analysis, half of all felony charges are getting dismissed in Harris County, though of course that could just be plain old incompetence and not necessarily ideological intent. So maybe the DA wants to get the armed citizen in this case because of corrupt influence against him, but it's also possible that the facts of this case are of only borderline compliance with the law. What's legal and what's right are notoriously different things. The law is a set of broad rules to try to sort out right and wrong, but certain specifics can break that framework. Self-defense attorney Andrew Branca has a great analysis of this case at Legal Insurrection, explaining why the armed citizen may be in trouble by the strict application of the law. And this isn't to say he wasn't justified in the layman moral sense, or he wasn't justified in intervening with lethal force in general. It's just to explain how one particular action may bring this guy some legal trouble. The 9 shots that killed the criminal break down into 3 distinct groups in Branca's analysis. The first group of 4 shots is fired as the criminal is walking away from the armed citizen, dropping the criminal to the ground. The second group of 4 shots is fired as the criminal is on the ground and the armed citizen is approaching him, neutralizing the threat. The 9th and final shot is where potential legal problems arise. The armed citizen approaches the criminal, at this point on the ground and not moving. The armed citizen grabs the fake gun, disarming the criminal, and after securing the weapon, fires one final shot, believed to be into the criminal's head. According to Branca's analysis, it's that final shot that may be a legal problem because it potentially lacked the imminent unlawful threat of deadly force that was present during the prior shots. In more plain terms, the lethal threat was already eliminated. The final shot was not in response to a lethal threat. It was simply excessive. And again, this isn't me or Branca saying that the armed citizen is a bad guy for doing it. It's just to acknowledge that under the law, an imminent lethal threat is necessary to justify any shot fired in response. In the case of that final shot, the prosecution may argue that the imminent lethal threat had already expired. Therefore, the final shot cannot be justified. Branca continues with an interesting legal theory that if he was defending this man, he'd argue that the final shot was accidental, and if you watch it, it does plausibly appear so. The man bends down to secure the gun, and in returning from his squat, his gun discharges. He doesn't appear to aim down his sights or set up for an obvious execution-style final shot. The shot just sort of happens awkwardly in the moment, and since the shooter would be justified in maintaining his muzzle on the criminal, given the armed robbery that occurred just prior, Branca says the pointing of the gun could not be deemed legally reckless. If it's not legally reckless to point, there would be no criminal liability in an accidental discharge, though perhaps civil liability could apply. So the moral of the story is terrible trigger discipline is actually a pathway to exoneration. It worked for Alec Baldwin, so it can probably work here too. And I get it. I'm not attacking Branca's analysis. I understand that from a legal perspective, intent matters. And the intent of that final shot will matter in how this case is treated legally. I just wish the system could recognize the primary intent of ending that threat just as aggressively as it was presented. But that's more of a moral appeal than a legal one, and that's why it's important not to conflate the two. The law is just an attempt to create a set of rules that can distinguish right from wrong in most cases, but specifics and technicals will create edge cases like this one where morally justified behavior is treated as legally suspect. On moral terms, it's quite simple. If you point a gun at somebody in aggression, you forfeit your right to live. And frankly, I don't much care how kind others are or not in eliminating the threat that you presented. If you don't want to be executed, don't threaten others with execution. It's a very simple proposition. Oh, but aren't you worried about the excesses of trigger-happy citizens imposing vigilante justice on an instant's whim without a more formal process? Perhaps, but not nearly as worried as I am by the alternatives of citizens too afraid to defend themselves and criminals emboldened by a belief that they won't. It's a question of incentives and leniency. What behaviors do you want to incentivize, and accordingly, what mistakes are you willing to forgive? If we under-scrutinize criminals with light sentences and early releases, and we over-scrutinize armed citizens who deal with that threat themselves, we will get more crimes by criminals who are unafraid of any consequences, and fewer armed citizens terrified of going to prison for making the slightest mistake. And the criminals do not fear those consequences, clearly, either from the justice system or from citizens prepared to stop them. Case in point, the exact same taqueria was robbed again this week.
Watch as a man uses a crowbar to get inside. The alarm blaring as he goes straight to the 3 gambling machines in the front, then heads to the cash register and empties it.
He's practically walking over the last guy's dead body to get in there, thinking that was a fluke. There's no way I get shot in the face too if I roll in there and try to cash out in the same way. That is a bet that the criminal should lose every single time. Instead, it's still a bet worth making. But perhaps justice will prevail in this case. The grand jury may opt not to bring any charges, or even if they do, the jury at trial would have to be unanimous in convicting him for the great crime of eliminating an active threat to the community. I'd actually be shocked if this guy faced any prison time, but that's not entirely the point. The point is that any pursuit of these charges and the waste of his time and money to defend against them is an additional injustice itself. Proper justice in this case is not paperwork and hearings and attorney's fees and a life already threatened further interrupted. Proper justice is a plate of free tacos and a Corona with lime and a box of ammo to reimburse him for the costs he incurred. Or maybe a Dos Equis instead. Actually, it's a great promotional opportunity for them. A thank you would be a nice gesture too, or gracias if you prefer authenticity. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Parler. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.